In that year, when the word morning still smelled of camphor and reheated coffee, Maggie Williams, 63, went out into the street with 2 suitcases that seemed bigger than her shadow and a purse with $847 counted. Her son James and daughter-in-law Jessica said, "You're too old-fashioned," as coldly as throwing away an old receipt, and the door closed behind her with a click that pierced her ear. The world shrank to the size of the sidewalk, the knot of the floral scarf she wore around her neck, the seam of her shoe that rubbed against her heel, the metallic smell of the rain announcing itself without falling. She recalled, as if it were a practical joke, that her late husband organized invoices by color and that she still kept her iron ruler, the one that didn't forgive deviations. Maggie promised herself she wouldn't beg. If life wanted her out in the open, she would learn to measure the wind. He stacked the suitcases next to the rusty bus pole, took a deep breath, and counted the money in small bills, as if caressing a tightrope before crossing it. The city seemed to look at her out of the corner of its eye, curious and cruel at the same time, while a pharmacy clock blinked 9:17, as if giving her a new time to start. I didn't know where I would sleep, but I did know what I wouldn't do. Accept the cargo label, because even items labeled waste can change shelves. The Sunset Motel charged $43 a night and displayed a tired neon sign that flickered like a sleepless eyelid. Maggie paid cash and received a heavy key, hand-engraved with the number 12. Inside, the air conditioner coughed intermittently, the carpet smelled of stale orange, and the mirror had a stain in one corner shaped like an ivy leaf, a detail she adopted as an involuntary talisman. On the small table, he placed his 847 as if they were seeds. One for today, one for tomorrow, one for fear. She opened the window slightly, letting in the sound of the highway, and, sitting on the edge of the bed, listened to the spring complain about its weight and its history. He decided that in the morning he would go to the library. Free internet, decent air, and the feeling of belonging to a place with clear rules, like the columns of a ledger. If you're still with me here at this fragile point, the voice narrating what many keep silent would say, "Tell me from which city you're following this story." Your comment could be the key to another. Sharing a story is like sharing a coat. He thought as he folded the $20 bill with the skill of someone folding a sheet of paper to fit just right in his pocket. And with that economy of gesture and hope, he turned off the light, knowing that darkness can also be organized if one learns to recognize its edges. The next morning it smelled of old paper and cheap coffee from the machine when Maggie walked through the doors of the public library. The murmur of keyboards and the soft tapping of turned pages brought back a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. He found a free computer, one of those that timed usage in 30-minute blocks, and began looking for jobs like someone sowing crops in arid land. Every ad seemed to call for youth disguised as experience, and experience disguised as youth, a cruel contradiction for a 63-year-old widow. But among the listings, as if it had been written for her, one appeared in discreet letters: bookkeeper, Mitchell's Garden Center. The pay was modest, $15 an hour, but the place was only 2 bus stops from the motel. She wrote down the number on a piece of paper, folded the corners so she wouldn't miss it, and put the sheet of paper in her purse along with the clinking coins. As he logged off, he realized his heart was beating with a different rhythm, that of someone who has found a furrow where they can plant hope. Mitchell's Garden Center smelled of damp earth and fertilizer, a mixture that Maggie found strangely comforting. Sarah Mitchell, the owner, greeted her with hands stained with substrate and an apron with embroidered sunflowers, a gesture that immediately broke down any stiffness. The interview was brief. Sarah needed to get her accounts in order, and Maggie offered decades of discipline with numbers. The deal was sealed with a hearty handshake. On her first day at work, sitting at a cash register that looked older than she was, Maggie noticed something others missed. Shelves filled with wilted, nearly discarded plants. They were green skeletons with fallen leaves, labeled as inevitable loss. But in Maggie's eyes, those plants were in the same condition as her, discarded before their time. As he filed receipts, he considered the irony that everything that seemed dead could, with care, breathe again. And there, among dusty boxes and overdue bills, the idea germinated that would end up changing not only his days, but his entire destiny. That night, back in room 12 of the Sunset Motel, Maggie couldn't stop thinking about the flower pots lined up like defeated soldiers. There was something about those plants that reminded her of herself, still with roots, even though the world thought they were finished. With the few dollars he had left after paying for shipping and a pack of crackers, he bought 2 flower pots on sale for $1 each and took them to the room. The smell of the motel mingled with that of the dry earth, and for the first time the space stopped feeling like a borrowed shelter and became a small laboratory of hope. With a half-used water bottle and a kitchen knife lent to her by the receptionist, she cut away dead leaves, loosened the soil, and spoke softly to the stems as if they were sick children. Hours passed, and although he saw no immediate changes, he slept with a different certainty. He had found a task, a routine, a reason. In the midst of that stillness, the motel was no longer just a $43 expense. It was the improvised nursery of his rebirth. And with that vision, he fell asleep, with the sound of the highway becoming an unexpected lullaby. The following days became a back and forth between the library, the garden center, and her room, converted into a makeshift greenhouse. With each plant she recovered, Maggie felt she was also reclaiming a part of herself that had been declared useless. When he saw the first green shoots after weeks of patient care, he felt a lump in his throat more powerful than any bank account. They were signs of life where others only saw garbage. That emotion was too great to contain alone. If you got here following this story, tell me in the comments where you're reading from. Your words may encourage someone else. That's what Maggie thought, convinced that sharing minimal victories was sowing community in an arid land of indifference. Within a month, I had more than 20 flower pots lined up on the windowsill, defying the motel dust and the apathy of the surroundings. And although money was still tight, for the first time in weeks, her mirror reflected a woman with eyes alight with purpose. One Saturday morning, Maggie carried the first 5 recovered plants to the garden center in a cardboard box. He placed them discreetly in a corner, as if he didn't want to impose himself, and waited for Sarah to see them. The owner, accustomed to weekly losses that numbered in the dozens, couldn't believe how alive those pots looked, with firm leaves and a green color that looked like it had just come out of a professional greenhouse. "Where did you get them?" he asked with raised eyebrows, but Maggie just smiled and said, "From the same place where everyone thinks there's nothing to look for." Within 2 days, they were all sold, and the first $8.47 appeared in the cash register, the exact same amount with which Maggie had been thrown out onto the street. That number, repeated like an ironic echo, was for her a sign that life also knew how to tell jokes with poetic justice. He kept a $20 bill as a souvenir in his wallet, promising himself he would never forget that feeling. More than an income, it was proof that his instinct could still pave the way where there had only been rubble before. That coincidence of figures seemed so powerful to him that night he wrote in a notebook he had bought at a second-hand bookstore, "I am not a waste, I am reborn." The letters were crooked, but full of determination. Maggie knew this could become something bigger, but she needed to maintain discipline, reinvest every dollar, save every penny, and not get carried away by euphoria. However, as she shared the news with a neighbor down the hall at the motel, she felt the need to say out loud that there was hope. And if you, who are reading this story up to this point, have also ever felt like you've been written off, leave me a comment and tell me where you're standing. Your words may be the respite someone needs. Maggie's story wasn't just hers. It was a bridge to other outcasts who still had hidden roots. With that in mind, he began buying entire batches of discarded plants, filling his motel room with dried-out stems that would soon bloom again. Every corner of number 12 was transformed into a miniature forest, a silent witness to a future that was already beginning to germinate. The space in the motel soon became insufficient. The nightstand was covered in flower pots. The windowsill was overflowing with new leaves, and even the bathroom housed a couple of ferns that seemed grateful for the humidity. Every morning before taking the bus to the garden center, Maggie watered her small green army with a reused plastic bottle, marking their watering schedules with tape as if they were patients in a hospital. The motel staff started joking, calling his room the Jungle of 12, but some also asked him for advice on reviving their own plants. What began as an intimate experiment became a hallway rumor, and that rumor soon attracted the curiosity of more customers. For Maggie, who was still carefully counting every dollar, the opportunity to sell some plants directly from the motel presented itself as an unexpected lifeline. It was the first spark of business beyond the garden center. Her pride was not in the still small profits, but in seeing that her name was beginning to be associated with something positive. The woman who brought life back to what seemed lost. And that social recognition, although minimal, had the taste of a balm after family rejection. One day, while recording invoices in the garden center office, Sarah Mitchell walked in with a look of surprise. I had noticed that the plants Maggie recovered not only sold faster, but that customers came back asking for them. Some said they looked more durable, others that they had a special shine on the leaves. Sarah, a practical businesswoman, understood that there was an unexplored niche there and proposed to Maggie that they formalize an agreement. She would recover plants and the garden center would sell them with a shared margin. The proposal meant moving from a secret hobby to a real alliance. Maggie agreed, although deep inside her she was afraid of failing if the demand exceeded her capacity. However, she recalled the time she had organized impossible family budgets and survived medical bills without knowing where the money would come from. If he had achieved that, he could also organize a makeshift nursery that would sustain new life. With the new agreement in place, Maggie transformed her routine into an exercise in almost military precision. In a notebook, he marked each pot with the rescue date, watering times, and type of improvised fertilizer. The motel room became a living board, trays lined up by species, wooden stakes with notes, and an earthy smell that covered the musty stench of the old walls. The other guests looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and mockery, but she no longer paid attention. She had a mission that kept her going. He gave each plant that revived a name, as if they were soldiers returning from an invisible battle. Victory, resilience, hope. It wasn't superstition. It was a reminder that even in discard there was identity. And when she delivered the plots to the garden center, she felt that with every leaf that shone in the sun, a part of her dignity was also lifted. What had begun with 2 flower pots bought for $1 was already beginning to take shape in an unexpected future. The initial success attracted more curious customers, and Maggie began receiving small orders directly to the motel. A young couple bought a recovered ficus tree and told him they planned to put it in their living room as a symbol of second chances. That comment was etched in his memory. He wasn't selling plants. He was selling living metaphors. And if you've made it this far by reading their journey, tell me in the comments if you've ever cared for something others thought was lost. Your story may inspire someone who feels withered today. Sharing this story is also part of making what seemed dry bloom. Maggie understood more and more. Her project was not just economic, it was an act of resistance against oblivion. As I folded my newly earned bills, I thought about how many more days I could pay for the motel and how many more flower pots would fit in room number 12. And in that simple calculation, the seeds of a green empire that I had not yet imagined were already hidden. As the months passed, the motel room became inadequate, and Maggie began renting a small garage behind a laundromat. The place smelled of wet soap and old gasoline, but to her it was a palace. Enough space to organize dozens of shelves with plants in recovery. Rent consumed a good part of his income, but he saw it as an investment, not an expense. He painted the walls with cheap lime, installed recycled light fixtures, and even built a homemade irrigation system using used plastic bottles and hoses. Each visit to the garden center confirmed that demand was growing. Customers were asking for more of those plants that come back to life. Word of mouth spread faster than his hands could work. And though fatigue accumulated in her knees and arthritic fingers, Maggie felt like every ache was an invisible medal. It was proof that she could still reinvent herself when everyone had given up on her. It was at that point that she met Eleanor Rodriguez, an SBDC advisor who visited small businesses to identify potential growth opportunities. Eleanor, with short hair and red glasses, had the analytical gaze of someone who could see a complete map where others only saw spots. He listened to Maggie attentively, walked around the makeshift garage, and said in a firm voice, "You're not saving plants, you're solving a national problem of gardening losses." That phrase was a lightning bolt that suddenly illuminated the entire panorama. Suddenly, Maggie stopped seeing herself as a woman surviving on salvaged flower pots. She now understood that she was a pioneer in a replicable model. The idea of licensing and franchising arose from that conversation. And although at first it sounded bigger than its potential, the seed was planted. Eleanor handed him a card with her number and an appointment for the following week. Maggie walked out of there with trembling hands, as if she were carrying in her pockets not only crumpled bills, but the draft of a business future. The meeting with Eleanor opened up a path Maggie had never considered, applying for an SBA loan to scale her project. The paperwork was an intimidating maze, filled with forms and clauses that seemed designed to discourage anyone without experience. But she, who had spent decades organizing family budgets and impossible household balance sheets, found familiar territory in that tangle. He spent entire nights in the library reviewing requirements, filling out boxes with the same meticulousness with which he once watered his plants. When she finally received approval for $150,000, she wept silently in the motel hallway, leaning against the door of room 12. It wasn't just money, it was recognition that the system believed in his idea. That check represented an opportunity to leave precariousness behind and open a dignified space for their green patients. The garage behind the laundry room would be just the prologue to something much bigger. With the loan in hand, he rented a 5,000 square foot warehouse that smelled of fresh cement and promise. There she installed metal shelving, a more sophisticated irrigation system, and hired 2 young assistants who learned from her the art of green patience. The business, which it named Phoenix Plant Recovery, began signing contracts in 3 different states. The word Phoenix was no coincidence. Each rescued plant symbolized rebirth, and each satisfied customer a victory against discarding. If you continue following this story this far, leave me a comment telling me from which country or city you're reading it. Your voice can also be a spark that ignites others, because what for some is simple entertainment, for someone else can be the push they needed to not give up. In less than 2 years, Maggie had already multiplied her operation in 12 states with 47 licensees. And although the figure of $2 million a year seemed like something out of a dream, for her it was nothing more than the logical consequence of having believed in what no one wanted to see. Success wasn't measured solely in contracts or numbers, it was measured in the expressions of returning clients, grateful that a revived plant had graced their dining room, their office, or even a funeral. Maggie began receiving invitations to speak at nurseries and gardening associations, where she told her story with the same honesty with which she watered her flower pots. He talked about the motel, the garage behind the laundromat, and the first batch that came in at $847, drawing tears and applause. The local press interviewed her, and a business magazine featured her under the title, "The Woman Who Turned Trash into a Green Empire." The public recognition surprised her, but what she valued most was the silent community that was growing around her message. People who had been dismissed from their jobs, broken families, invisible retirees, all found a spark of hope in her story. Each lecture was like watering a human garden, where other people's stories also flourished. And in that exchange, Maggie understood that her mission was much deeper than saving leaves and roots. It was then that she decided to take a step that would symbolize her entire journey, buying a home that would reflect the magnitude of her rebirth. The opportunity came with the legendary Harrison Estate in Millbrook Heights, a 12,000 square foot mansion surrounded by 8 acres and featuring a glass-enclosed greenhouse that looked like something out of a dream. The price was $3.8 million, a figure that years ago would have seemed like an incomprehensible language. But now, with solid accounts and a 7-figure net worth, he was able to make the cash offer. When he received confirmation that the property was his, he felt like his life had come full circle. He had gone from sleeping in a damp motel to living in a mansion with a museum-worthy interior garden. Every wall of that house would be a reminder that she had not been defeated, but liberated. Signing the purchase documents was like watering the final seed of his silent revenge. The news appeared in the newspapers the next day, with her name on the front page, and the entire city murmured about the feat of the woman who transformed waste into greatness. The morning after the newspaper reported the purchase, the mansion's bell rang at 9:17, the same time that had signaled his eviction years earlier. Upon opening the door, Maggie found James, Jessica, and the 2 grandchildren, Emma, 16, and Tony, 14, on the porch. They wore forced smiles and carried a bouquet of flowers bought at the last minute, wrapped in cheap cellophane that rustled in the wind. The son, his voice breaking, said they had come to congratulate her, but his eyes avoided his mother's. Maggie, who had already learned to read silences, knew immediately that behind that visit there was more need than celebration. The children, confused, hugged their grandmother sincerely, while Jessica clutched the purse as if it were hiding a secret. On that threshold, Maggie felt that life offered her a mirror. The same family that had rejected her now sought refuge under her roof. But this time, it would be her who would set the conditions. Calmly, he invited them into the main hall, a space lit by large windows overlooking the greenhouse. There, as the scent of orchids filled the air, James confessed that he had lost his job and that debt was drowning them. Jessica looked down, and Maggie knew the lie had reached. Even the grandchildren, who believed everything was still in order. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a letter James had written months earlier, secretly asking her to come back because they couldn't afford the expenses. The confrontation was direct, but without shouting. Maggie had learned that dignity doesn't need volume. And if you, who have followed this story this far, recognize something from your own life in it, leave a comment and share it. Maybe someone close to you needs to hear this part of the story. The grandchildren listened attentively, with tears in their eyes, as their grandmother explained that they would always have a place with her, but that the doors for their parents would only open with real changes. That clear boundary was, at the same time, the wound and the healing that the family needed to face. Emma and Tony stayed at the mansion for a few days, and in their teenage laughter, Maggie discovered the deepest reward of her entire journey. I watched them run around the greenhouse, admiring the lilies and begonias as if they were magical creatures, and I understood that not all was lost in the family chain. The grandchildren weren't to blame for their parents' decisions, and with them they could rebuild a clean bond, free of lingering resentments. He taught them how to transplant orchids, how to measure soil moisture, and even how to recognize when a plant needed more sun than shade. Every evening the greenhouse was filled with simple conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the icy silence of the motel years before. In those moments, Maggie felt that the circle of life had given her a new role. Not just a businesswoman, but a guardian of memory and future, and he understood with a lump in his throat that the true legacy he could leave behind was not money, but resilience. Because what was learned in the darkness of discarding was what now illuminated the new generations. James and Jessica, on the other hand, left the mansion empty-handed and with their pride wounded. There were no hugs or immediate promises, just a thick silence that hung in the air like a forgotten cobweb. Maggie didn't close the door with resentment, but with firmness. She knew she couldn't repeat the story of inverted abandonment. He made it clear to them that there would always be room for them if they demonstrated with actions, not just words, that they were willing to change. It was a painful decision, but also liberating. It wasn't about revenge, but about dignity. Opening the door unconditionally would be repeating the cycle of dependency that had brought her to the brink of oblivion. With that clarity, he returned to the greenhouse and stroked the leaves of a reborn rosebush, a silent symbol of his own path. The echo of her grandchildren's voices in the hallway was confirmation that, despite the fractures, something in the family could still flourish. The following months consolidated Maggie not only as a successful businesswoman, but also as a moral leader in her community. Neighbors, former clients, and even strangers came to the mansion to hear his story, convinced that he was living proof that discards can be turned into treasure. She greeted each visit with the same calm with which she once watered the motel's flower pots, remembering that it all started with $847 and a humid room. The contrast was so great that at times it seemed like a movie told in impossible chapters. But the echo of her grandchildren's footsteps in the hallways, the murmur of the greenhouse in the mornings, and the hard-earned respect confirmed that it was all real. Silently, every night she thanked the version of herself that, in the darkness, had decided not to give up. And she understood that true luxury was not in the large windows or the acres of land, but in having proven herself worthy. The past was no longer a condemnation, but the fertile ground for his victory. Sharing her story on a forum, Maggie wrote simply, "Being discarded didn't make me worthless. It freed me to discover my true worth." And if you've made it this far, join me by leaving a comment and sharing this story, because you never know who you might be inspiring right now. The cycle closed with poetic justice. The woman who was once expelled with 2 suitcases and less than $1,000 now opened a greenhouse in the most coveted mansion in the city. James and Jessica would have to follow their own path to redemption, while Emma and Tony inherited the lessons of resilience. The Phoenix plant recovery business continued to expand, but for Maggie, the most important thing was the certainty that her life had taken deep roots in solid ground. The waste had become abundance and the wound had become victory. Her story, like the plants she rescued, was proof that even what seems dead can bloom again. And with that truth tattooed on her soul, she closed the notebook where she recorded her accounts, convinced that living well would always be the best form of revenge.